Thank you so much, Sinead. First of all, can I just say thank you to you and to EFSAS for coming all the way from Amsterdam to London to be part of this and for co-hosting this with the Labour Foreign Policy Group. We're really honoured to have such a distinguished panel of speakers who have extensive expertise in their area of knowledge. And maybe, I don't know if you remember what James mentioned around our work on China, but the Labour Foreign Policy Group is a member-led organisation within the Labour Party. If you are a member of the Labour Party, you can join us and become a member. We have a China working group which James chairs, and they have their own terms of reference which they work on all year round, and we've got some reports on our website which you can access and you can read. So please do that. Before I sort of start, I want to tell a story. When I was 11 years old, my dad gave me this book. It was Nancy Dupree's Travel Guide to Afghanistan. And she was the wife of the American ambassador to Afghanistan in the 1960s. And she travelled all across the country, so from Kandahar to Helmand to Bamyan. And reading that book as a child, I was fascinated really. I thought, oh, there might be one day that I could go to Afghanistan and actually visit these places. And so I started highlighting them in my book. And then when I was 16 years old, my uncle decided to get married in Afghanistan, and my parents said, let's go on a family holiday. And I thought, well, this is my moment and chance to go and visit all the places in Afghanistan that I'd highlighted in Nancy's book. With a lot of pleading and begging, I finally convinced my dad to let us go to Bamyan. Bamyan is a province, I'm sure if people have heard of it, it's famous for the Buddhas that the Taliban blew up when they were first in power. And I really wanted to go and visit the Buddhas. And on the road to Bamyan, the road was not tarmacked at all. So it was a rocky journey that we made in a borrowed 4x4. But one of the things that I noticed in Bamyan, in all the different areas that I went to, this was in 2007, on all the sides of the infrastructure projects, there was the flag of China and a little note that always said, this was completed with thanks to the Chinese government. And for me that was very strange as a young teenager. I was going to all these different areas in Afghanistan and I was coming across different provinces that were divided basically between NATO and its allies, doing different types of activities that suited their own interests. And that included China, and that was in 2007. But a lot has changed since then. I've basically spent most of that time, since I was 16, working on Afghanistan, and trying to understand why so many countries keep making the same fatal mistakes there, and why Afghanistan continues to be at the receiving end of these failed policies. The second is that China has increasingly stepped up its activities in Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover, but nobody's really paying attention to this as much as we need to. And so I'm really glad that we're having this discussion. So before I highlight some of the ways that China's doing this in Afghanistan and its reasoning as to why, I want to point out very clearly that I'm not a China expert. My expertise is on Afghanistan, but that expertise demands that we look at the role that China plays and continues to play in Afghanistan and what that means here for us in the UK. But before I do this, I want us to understand some foundational sort of things. During the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, the democratically supported government setup that the UK supported, a large part of China supported US efforts and the Afghan government in the country. It contributed to infrastructure projects, building hospitals and roads and so on. And as my colleague said, China shares a border with Afghanistan. It's one of the reasons why it did this, but also its close ties to Pakistan. Its difficult relationship with India were some of the motivating factors for this. For me, I see this as China was biding its time, seeing how the US intervention would play out. And it's important to see that in the context of China's security concerns tied to the Uyghur issue. During the Islamic Republic, the democratic setup, many Uyghurs took refuge in parts of Afghanistan. And when the Taliban returned, there were reports that many of them were sent back to China on the request of the Chinese. And that's the Taliban actively cooperating with the Chinese. The second is that since the announcement of the NATO withdrawal in Afghanistan and the subsequent takeover by the Taliban, this has meant that Western influence in the Central Asian and South Asian region has considerably declined. In essence, what we're talking about here is the de-Americanization of security in Central and South Asia. This has given opportunities to regional powers, specifically China, to have more active security strategies in the region. Now, China's security issue around Afghanistan relates to the Uyghur East Turkestan Islamic Movement. It's an organization that China accuses of fomenting separatism and terrorist attacks inside of China. And since August 2021, since the Taliban takeover, China's really defined its policy around this issue. It states that its overarching goal in Afghanistan is to prevent terrorism and violent extremism from destabilizing the region, specifically the spillover of Islamic extremism into Western China and the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. China believes that a destabilized Afghanistan will provide fertile ground for groups like that and others to use Afghanistan as a basing territory. The third is the economic. In 2007, China paid around $3 billion for a 30-year lease at the massive copper deposit of Misainak. Misainak is in Wardak province, just outside of Kabul, about an hour or 2 hours away. They promised to build mines, factories, schools, roads, and a railway. And they also promised to protect the remains of an ancient Buddhist city nearby, create jobs for Afghans, and generate revenue for the Afghan state. The Chinese contractor allegedly paid a huge kickback to the then Minister of Mines, built a fence at the site, took some potshots from insurgents, packed up, and then left. Beijing basically refused to renegotiate the contract, and the site remains untouched today. The Taliban have been keen to re-engage China on this project, but China understands that restarting this project will require security, and that means defending any Chinese contractors at the Misainak against ISIS-K and other growing tensions within the Taliban movement. How does that lead to the three concerns that I think that China's expansionism in Afghanistan relates to? So there's three areas. The first is diplomacy. And the reason why this is an issue is because I don't know if you've been paying attention, but no other country apart from the European Union has a political representation in Kabul at the moment. But the Chinese actually presented official documents to the Taliban and presented a new ambassador to the Taliban regime. And this is incredibly worrying, considering that, as James outlined, this is a regime that denies girls an education, denies women the right to work, attacks those who worked in the Afghan National Defense Security Forces who were trained by NATO. And increasingly this is worrying because this is on the route to normalizing a terrorist organization that is in charge of a nation state. These are UN-recognized terrorists who are leading a regime in Afghanistan that is terrorizing the population of Afghanistan and basically appropriating a gender apartheid regime. And if China continues down this road, it will give encouragement to other countries in the region who don't want to be the first to recognize the Taliban regime, but this will help them on the road to that. So that's the first diplomatic problem that I see. The second is in relation to Pakistan. We all know Afghanistan and Pakistan have had many problems and many issues over the last 20 plus years, not just over the Islamic Republic government, but prior to that. In that Pakistan hosted and supported and funded the Taliban against the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And at the moment, Pakistan is using the Belt and Road Initiative as a way to entice China into a deal in bringing Afghanistan into this by convincing the Taliban to be part of this initiative. This is a huge issue because Pakistan continues to exercise control over the Taliban in terms of how it implements its policies. And this is worrying going forward, considering that this will be de facto Chinese influence in Afghanistan through the Pakistan route. The second thing I see is security. And the reason why I mention security is because, as I mentioned previously, China, it says that it sees its engagement with the Taliban regime around the issue of counterterrorism, effectively, around this Turkestan Islamic movement attacking inland China. But for me, I see this as not an excuse in a sense, because I think some of them have, there's legitimate concerns here, but around extremist groups. But I think that this is tied into the Belt Road Initiative around the security issue of Chinese contractors accessing contracts that the Taliban are ready to give them inside Afghanistan, but also making sure that Chinese security officials have access to Borough Air Base. This is something that's not really looked at, but if you think about it, NATO withdrew from the Bagram Air Base. There are no US or NATO military personnel in Afghanistan at this current moment in time. And if China wanted to, it could create a deal with the Taliban that allowed Chinese security officials to have access to Bagram Air Base under the pretext of the Belt and Road Initiative, and therefore creating a security issue and threat not only to the West in terms of Chinese influence inside Afghanistan, but also to the wider region, and then our question around how we relate to Iran. The second is around the Uyghur issue, which I already mentioned. And the last thing is on the economics. The economics are the most important because recently Afghanistan signed, the Taliban regime signed a contract with a Chinese contractor for an oil extraction deal from the Amur Darya Basin. Under this agreement, it said that there will be an investment of 514 million over 3 years, and the contract will be valid for 25 years. Since July 2022, China has granted 98% of Afghan goods a zero tariff treatment and increased the import of Afghan pine nuts. And so they're trying to give incentives to the Taliban why these deals are really good. But actually, the Taliban came out and said that this deal only gives them 20% profit, and that they hope that one day they will get 75%. But these deals, as we've seen from Pakistan, from Sri Lanka, and so on, can actually create problems for those countries. There is another deal right now that Beijing is currently looking at with the Taliban. It's 10 billion for access to lithium deposits. And they've enticed the Taliban with creating 120,000 direct jobs and investment for infrastructure building and so on and so forth. But all of these initiatives need to be looked at with a pinch of salt, considering that this is China buying economic power inside these countries, and therefore creating a problem when it comes to defecting on loans and so forth and so on. For countries like Afghanistan, where currently half of the population is currently struggling with food instability, with earthquakes, with drought. A country like that does not need another regional power coming in and taking advantage and it's being led by a regime that does not have the skills nor the education to be able to deal with these kind of complex economic contracts and issues. And so, I don't want to continue too long, but the final thing I'd like to say on this is that we're not paying enough attention to what China's doing in Afghanistan and how that is going to impact us in the future, especially relating to security around how we respond to the Iran nuclear issue, how we respond to issues in the Middle East, and going forward on issues relating to Taiwan and extending outside of that. Thank you so much for listening.